Thank you again to our distinguished speakers and to Secretary Nicolas for chairing the welcome plenary. At this point, we would like to turn over the floor to Dr. Colleen, who is Chair of the World Bank NOMAD Capacity Building Group, Senior Advisor at UNITAR, and Advisor to the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for International Migration, for the session on attaining the SDGs through local leadership.
Hello everybody again. We are moving into a less formal part of the program here, but we've decided to stay up here because there's going to be a PowerPoint presentation. We'll start with that. So this is a presentation on attaining the SDGs through local leadership. And what I will do in the next 10 slides or so is really just outline a framing of the SDGs. We heard about them this morning in the opening, the targets that relate to migration policy, and then a few words on the Quito local agenda on migration and development. This is a way to get us thinking a little bit for those of you who are less familiar and those of you who are familiar with these goals that have been signed off onto by the international community, by states, and their relevance, which we'll be discussing with all of you in a city and regional context. So first, I will outline the SDGs and their relevance. There are 17 SDGs, 17 goals, and each of the goals includes detailed targets that qualify how these goals will be attained. In addition, there are what we call indicators, which quantify how those targets are attained. Now, there's some importance to this because later on we'll be looking at the targets. So again, the targets are what qualify how the goals are described, how the goals will be achieved. And there are different targets for each goal. The second part of this presentation will look at some of those targets relating to migration. And then finally, I'll look, as I said, we'll look a little bit at the Quito local agenda, as I mentioned earlier. After my rather technical presentation, so I'll try to keep it short, we will have feedback from a number of distinguished panelists here who I'll already present. In fact, it's not so much feedback as it is comments from their own professional and practitioners' perspectives on what they see as the work that's being done by cities and cities networks around reaching some of these migration and development policy considerations, and what also are some of the obstacles to implementing these. And then we will open the floor for a discussion with all of you that will include a tour de table by my colleague here, Ms. Rielon, from the Joint Migration Development Initiative. But first, let me briefly introduce the distinguished panel of discussants who will speak after the slides that I've presented on the Sustainable Development Goals. They are Dr. Howard Duncan, who is the Executive Director of Metropolis International. Metropolis International is an international network of researchers, policymakers, and community groups who are working on issues of migration and diversity. Dr. Howard Duncan is responsible for, among many things, expanding the geographical scope of this network's work, including in this area, in the Asia area, where he developed a tripartite secretariat for the Asian initiatives, and this secretariat is located in Manila, Seoul, and Beijing. Dr. Howard Duncan is also the editor of International Migration, a prestigious journal on international migration policy. Then we have Dr. Bernadilla Chandradewi, Secretary General of the Union of Cities and Local Governments for the Asia Pacific region, the UCLG is the abbreviation. It's an umbrella organization for cities, local government, and municipal associations around the world, headquartered in Barcelona. And Dr. Chandradewi is the first woman Secretary General among the UCLG regional sections, with over 15 years of experience in capacity building and local work with local governments. Ms. Cynthia Rielon, who many of you met yesterday during the course organized by the Joint Migration and Development Initiative, an interagency program on migration development. Dr. Rielon is also, Cynthia Rielon is also well familiar in the area of crisis displacement, having served as Deputy Chief of Mission for IOM in Indonesia during the tsunami of 2004. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Edna Ko, who is the Vice President of Public Affairs of the University of the Philippines. She's also a distinguished full professor at the UP Diliman National College of Public Administration and Governance, and serves as the Executive Director within the University of the Center for Integrative and Development Studies. As we heard from Assistant Secretary General Nikhil Seth earlier in the video presentation, we will also have the launch of the Centre International de Formation pour les Acteurs Locaux, which is the local training center network of UNITAR, and the launch for the CFAL Center in the Philippines will take place this evening, and Dr. Ko has been appointed the director of CFAL Philippines. So now moving on to this presentation, and very quick history on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, the origins, and this slide is unclear, the origins of the 2030 Agenda is really the convergence of two parallel policy processes. One of them, the Millennium Development Goals, which we heard of this morning, focus very much around social and human development and the reduction in poverty, and the other around sustainable development, the so-called Environment and Development Nexus, which began in 1992 in Rio with the Rio Intergovernmental Conference and the follow-up meeting 20 years later. And so what you have is a merger or convergence of these two policy areas in the context of the lead up to the 2030 Development Agenda to form a single, universal, and comprehensive development agenda known as the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Next slide. The backdrop of the 2030 Development Agenda is thus one of integrated development. So many of you will be familiar with this convergence of three circles on your left-hand side, which are the 3 feet of the stool for sustainable development, a concept that first emerged in 1987 around economic, social, and environmental causes, all forming what we refer to as sustainable development. More closely associated now with the agenda, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, are the 5 Ps, the so-called 5 Ps of people to end poverty and hunger, planet, to protect the planet from degradation, prosperity, to ensure that all human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives, peace, to foster peace, just and inclusive societies, and finally, partnerships, new forms of partnerships to achieve the SDGs. Next slide. So what are the SDGs? For those who are less familiar with them, here they are up on one slide. The 17 goals, sustainable development goals adopted by states in September of 2015, on the 25th of September, to be exact. The Sustainable Development Forum at the time included a declaration and the operational framework, which are these goals. Now, the goals themselves are quite specific, in fact, and they're not really captured in the boxes that you have here, so I'll read them out briefly. The first goal is around ending poverty in all its forms. The second is to end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. That's goal 2. Goal 3 is to ensure healthy lives and promote the well-being for all at all ages. Goal 4, around education, inclusive and equitable quality education, and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. Goal 5 is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Goal 6 is to ensure the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. 7, access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Goal 8, to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, and here important on the aspect of migration, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Goal 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Goal 10 is to reduce inequality within and between countries. Goal 11, and we'll come back to this one, is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Goal 12, to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Goal 13, to take urgent action against climate change. 14, to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, fisheries. Goal 15, to protect and restore and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, issues of degradation, desertification. Goal 16, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies, to provide access to justice for all, and to build effective and accountable and inclusive institutions at all levels. Here again, very relevant in cities. And 17, to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. Next slide, please. So, why are these goals important? As Professor Jeffrey Sachs, somebody who has had a strong hand in developing the MDGs and now the SDGs, posits, will a new set of goals help the world shift from a dangerous business-as-usual path to one of true sustainable development? There are a number of reasons why setting goals is important. The first one is the goals define benchmarks for global achievement and serve to prioritize. The SDGs matter because they reflect common priorities endorsed by states. Second, the goals are essential for social and political mobilization. Multi-stakeholder processes are essential for tackling the complex challenges of sustainable development and the fight against poverty, hunger, and disease. Third, a third way that the goals matter is to spur epistemic communities, so networks of expertise, knowledge, and practice that can rally around specific areas for action. Fourth, goals force us to quantify what is required to meet these challenges and to step up to the plate in addressing the huge disparities between the capacities within countries and between countries. And fifth, with goals on which states must account for progress in achieving them, there is accountability. In some cases, there is also peer pressure to perform. And we may presume some transparency in terms of who is taking what forward and how. Next slide. This last slide, the general slide on the SDGs, is a figure that illustrates the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, where you have in the top triangle the vision and the principles, which are the vision and principles that are stated in the declaration, the 2030 Declaration. The reverse triangle, the results framework, which are the 17 goals. And you have on either side, on the bottom triangles on the right, one that is very much still up for deliberation, including in terms of the role played by cities and regions when it comes to the follow-up and the reporting of how progress is taking place between this year, 2016, and every year through the deadline of 2030. And on the left, in yellow, you have the triangle on the implementation. And I'll finish my remarks by speaking on the slide on the left hand, in other words, the implementation slide. Next slide, please. Slide. Here we have, from IOM, a summary of the targets, as I was mentioning, that the targets that explicitly refer to migration policy. In the bottom two-thirds of this slide, you see that there are a number of goals that have specific references to migration. We looked at goal 4 around education and opportunities for lifelong learning. Within that goal, there is a target. So one of the ways to achieve that goal on education, lifelong learning, is a target which speaks of increasing the opportunities for student mobility, for scholarships for people to study abroad. Another important area of work that is reflected in targets across different goals is countering human trafficking. You see that in three of the goals: Goal 5, Goal 8, and Goal 16. Another important target is with respect to protecting the rights of workers, including migrant workers, and especially women migrant workers, that's specified in the target under Goal 8 on decent employment. I believe it was Oves from IOM who spoke about another strategically important target, which is target 7 under the Goal 10 on reducing the inequalities between and within countries. When we speak of reducing inequalities between and within countries, one of the areas for consideration is migration management, how we manage migration better. And we might presume that there are different interpretations of this, that doesn't just mean stopping people from moving, it means making people move in a way that is better for them and better for development. So a more fluid, more circular mobility regimes within countries. That's under Goal 10, target 10.7. Finally, another interesting target that is relevant certainly to the work of many cities, including cities here in the Philippines, I know we'll hear more about it, is under the Goal 17. I mentioned that Goal 17, for those who've studied the Millennium Development Goals, is similar to the last Millennium Goal number 8. It's everything to do with, well, how are we going to get this done? What type of partnerships are required? What types of research is required? What type of evidence do we need? And so some aspects of Goal 17 are around the dearth or the lack of data when it comes to informing migration policy. One of the very specific targets under Goal 17 is to collect data by different categories, and one of them is by migratory status. So with the collection of data on migrants, we will presumably know more, have more microdata on the well-being of migrants, and also be able to judge how they're faring vis-a-vis other citizens in our cities and regions. There are other areas that indirectly, not explicitly, refer to migration. Many of them are around the area of resilience and forced displacement in the Goals 1, 11, and 13. And for the sake of time, we'll move to the next slide, and to the next slide again. And I'll speak just briefly around some of the implications or observations with respect to these targets on migration. I had mentioned earlier in my opening remarks that the truth is, behind the scenes, it was questionable whether migration and refugee policy would even find its way into the targets that I was just mentioning during the time when these goals were being developed. It's quite surprising for many of us to think that migration may not have made its way into the SDGs, but there was some questioning around how do we conceive of and how do we understand the relationship between migration and development. What is evident both with what is reflected in the targets and more generally in the ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals are these 4 considerations. There are many others, and I look forward to hearing your views. The first one is around the fact that migrants need to migrants need to be able to also take advantage of all of the benefits of the SDGs, even the ones in which they are not explicitly stated. So, for instance, the goal on health is one where migrants and refugees are not explicitly stated, and yet it is clear that they also should be able to benefit from this goal, as do other citizens of the world. The high principle, the overarching spirit of the 2030 Agenda, if you read it and look at the declaration, is around this issue of leaving no one behind. And there was some concern that the people who would be left behind are migrants and refugees. And so, again, this idea that all of the SDGs, all of the goals apply to migrants as they do to others. It's clear that we will need a dedicated commitment to achieve the migration-related targets of the SDGs. and that migrants must be empowered to contribute to their host and destination communities and those of origin so as to deliver on the SDGs. And finally, to implement the SDGs is to address the root causes of involuntary and irregular migration. If we move to the penultimate slide, which looks at the Quito Local Agenda. The Quito Local Agenda on Migration and Development, endorsed in Quito in November of last year, is a document that was prepared during a consultation process involving over 50 cities and city networks, the whole apparatus of the UN agencies that deal with migration. And what we did was we looked across all of the SDGs, the areas where cities are working to improve the conditions and to facilitate conditions under which migrants can contribute where they are and often in their countries of origin as well. Interestingly, unlike the SDGs, where there's little focus in goal 11 on cities with respect to migration, we started with goal 11. In other words, what does it mean to make a city more inclusive? What does it mean to make a city more safe? And what does it mean to make a city more resilient and sustainable? Well, the action items 1, 2, 3 break down goal 11 of the SDGs on cities in relation to migrants and refugees. It looks like my presentation was being timed. No, it isn't. And finally, and we can speak about the Quito Local Agenda. You all have a hard copy of it in your documentation, received it earlier, and this is the basis for two of the two themes of the next 2 days. In other words, the Area 6 on promoting human prosperity, including engaging with diaspora for furthering development, and in the area of assuring protection to those who are in need of protection, including refugees and migrants in vulnerable situations. This last slide just enumerates some of the many obstacles that we've heard from city leaders and city administrators over the last 3 to 4 years. Many obstacles that are certainly pertinent to the implementation of the Quito Local Agenda as they are to the implementation of the SDGs. And with the very final slide that can be put up, we have more information on the, for those of you who have an interest in learning about the SDGs through UNITAR's website. But I will now pass the floor first to Dr. Howard Duncan for his comments as somebody who's really been working with cities probably longer than most, the last 20 years.
Well, thank you very much, Colleen, for the invitation to be here today. I want to start by, first of all, congratulating Colleen, UNITAR, CFO, IOM, the ADB, and the others who are behind this extraordinary initiative. Even though I suppose by now in your third year you are somewhat taking this initiative, I wouldn't say for granted, but you're kind of getting used to it. To me, there's something very, very profound about this organization, about this initiative, about bringing these three basic concepts together, these three concepts being migration, cities, and development. Now, because I'm a bit of an academic, I'm going to talk at perhaps a more general level than some others here. I get completely lost in 17 goals and 150 targets and 3,000 indicators. I just can't do this. So I'm going to indulge myself a little bit and just talk at a very general level. But I think it's important, and I even hope interesting, to think about some of the fundamentals here. And it's by having gatherings like this that we're able to sit back and think about some of these fundamentals. Now, it's been a long time coming that the concepts of migration and development were formally linked, as they have been. And again, I would like to congratulate all of those who managed to have migration brought so integrally into the Sustainable Development Goals. I think this is an astounding achievement. But I want to say something that I hope is provocative, and I'll expand on this a little bit tomorrow. If it's a dud, I won't expand on it tomorrow, but I hope this is provocative. I'd like to suggest, first of all, that cities themselves are, in human history, the most important, the most effective device for human development that we have ever seen. When we talk about development in forums like this, when we talk about development at the United Nations, we tend to get right into specific activities. And of course, these days we spend a great deal of time talking about inclusive development, which of course I commend. But I would like you to pause and just think about the possibility that the most important development tool in human history is the city. When you think about what cities are, and I'll say more about this tomorrow because I've only got a couple more minutes left actually. When you think about what cities are, it reflects some of the things that Ove Sarmad opened up with today. This confluence of human ingenuity, of human capital that gets converted into prosperity and human well-being in ways that are far more effective than when we all lived a rural life. We were reminded that the world's settlement now has reached a point of over 50% urban, and this matters, I think, a great deal. But let me go back to these three basic concepts: migration, development, and cities. So I've just said something outrageous, that cities are the world's most important, most effective instrument for development. And let me just point out something that I think is obvious, but that we don't always recognize, that cities result from migration. Were it not for migration, cities would not exist. And so, just using a little bit of simple deductive logic, if it were not for migration, we would not have human development at all in the way that we do in this world today. So the link between migration and development, to a large extent, is through the vehicle of cities. So that's just a very, very general point. But something very important follows out of this point, and that has to do with governance. And we've already alluded to this today. We've heard, and indeed, I think it was Ove's quoted Ambassador Swing's comment about the reality of lived migration is in cities. But let's think about it a slightly different way. National governments, of course, control borders. National governments in general issue visas. It's not local governments who do so, it's national governments who do so. And the ability of national governments to control their borders has a great deal of impact on the nature of migration to the cities within the states. So migrants, we know, and we've known this for a very long time, overwhelmingly settle in cities, but not as a result of policies, not directly at least, as a result of policies set by cities. So you might, in a very crude way, think that it's national governments who are the actors here, and it is cities who are in the position of being the reactors. And I would just like to suggest that this is not exactly the best position for cities to be in. Now, if you look, and I can look at my own country here. I'm from Canada, like my friend Colleen. We have a constitution now that goes back roughly 150 years. And in the Canadian Constitution, and this is not unusual around the world, cities essentially are given no authorities, none. The Constitution specifies authorities for the national government, it specifies authorities for the provincial governments, and it simply says, with regard to municipal affairs, it's up to the provinces to figure this out. So cities have very limited authorities, generally speaking, And this is, I think, largely a result of the fact that constitutions were written when populations were rural. And what I would like to hope, looking down the road, is that we can engage in conversations, perhaps constitutional conversations, that would allocate more authorities to cities so that they can have a bigger role, a more effective role at the table, the migration policy table, at the development table, and that they are better able to manage their own affairs, because sometimes the way that migration affects cities is something that all they can do is react to, as opposed to control. So when you think in general about migration and its impact on cities, you're talking to a large extent about population growth, and in some cases, very, very sudden population growth. So at least I would think that national governments ought to bring cities to the migration policy table, if only to allow cities to be able to better respond, and therefore, in today's context, to help us all achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the first general point I would like to make. I'm down to 3 minutes, so I'll be quicker with the next two. I'd like us, and I say this as a result of my participation at the IOM's Migrants and Cities Conference in Geneva last October, where I was very struck, and this conference, as we have heard already, brought over 600 people, a great number of mayors and deputy mayors and so on from around the world. And what struck me, and I think it's very important for us here today to remember this, what struck me is that not all cities are in this, well, I'll put this a different way. We're not all European cities. A lot of the discussion on migration in cities is generated out of the challenges that European cities face today. And what really struck me is that cities in the global north, to be very, very general, have a very different set of challenges from cities in the global south when it comes to responding to migration. And I think a lot of the conversation that we have around the world, and I'm not pointing fingers at all, but it does strike me that much of the conversation, much of the issues that we are asked to deal with are issues that are facing cities in the global north, and that we do not always or often enough take into account conditions for cities in the global south. Now, I remember hearing many people from mayors in the global south talking about rapid arrivals of very, very large numbers of people, and the basic infrastructure in their cities was simply unable to cope. That's a very different sort of problem from those faced in cities in Europe, about which we have heard so much, and quite rightly so, but have heard so much about over the last few years. So for a city in the global south, the primary challenge regarding migration may not be diversity management or being inclusive or respecting rights. It may be something that, from my point of view, is far more urgent, providing basic services such as drinkable water or sanitation, or ensuring that there are transportation routes that allow ambulances to reach people who are in need, providing for basic health care or education, and so on. So if you are in a city that is struggling to provide even the basic amenities to its own citizens, and suddenly 300,000 people arrive in 1 year, this is a very different challenge than that faced by Cologne, Germany, with the arrival of a few 10,000 migrants last year. So my general point is, let's be careful not to treat all cities or all conditions the same when we think about how we will implement the Sustainable Development Goals. The last point I'll make, and I am out of time, so I'll be very quick, Somebody raised this earlier today already, and I was very happy to hear this. With respect to refugees and refugee camps, I think there's two things to note here. What was already said is that there are now more refugees living in cities than in refugee camps, because when you have a protracted refugee situation of 25 or 30 years, people do get a little bit fed up with living in the camps, and they move into the cities that are nearby. And this is understandable, but it does present challenges to the cities, both political challenges and practical challenges. But something that we might want to think about a little bit more seriously is the fact that many refugee camps, especially those that have been around for a long time, are cities. And when we think about managing camps, we might spend some time thinking about managing them as cities themselves. So I will just leave you with those 3 points, and tomorrow when I'm up here again, I'll say a little bit more about my view that cities are the most important development instrument achieved in human history. Thank you very much.
We will now hear from Secretary General Chandra Dewi from UCLG.
Dear mayors, governors, partners, very good morning. Magandang umaga. Buenos dias, bonjour, namaste, whatever languages you have. And thanks, first of all, to the organizers for inviting me. When I was invited to speak, I was not sure whether I should come here or not. The reason is that I didn't join the first and second global mayors. And this issue also quite new for many of us. But I decided to come because I also been a migrant before. And I think many of us have also experienced being migrant. I came from small town, moved to Jakarta, and spent 20 years in Japan. I was a foreign student, foreign worker as well. So then I think this migration theme touched to everyone. I can see the struggles being migrants, and I see also how foreigners living in overseas countries struggle also to get good educations. And also we have different cultures, especially when we live in cities, we don't even know the neighbors, who are our neighbors. So these kind of things also give me a kind of important kind of feeling that we really need to work on it more, because in Asia Pacific itself, we see this big number of people move to the cities to get a better life, and many of us here are lucky because we managed to get a better career, better living, but thousands of others ended up in slum, ended up in locations where they cannot have a better life like what we have here. So this is why I decided to come, because I also want to learn from others. And in Asia Pacific itself, the number of megacities have been increasing. We have more than 17 right now, with cities that have population more than 10 million. And the numbers is expected to increase for 22 cities, megacities in this region. And the rapid urbanization also reached a quite alarming level. And almost major cities, bigger cities in Asia Pacific, major population lives in slum. Like India, Mumbai, more than 50% of people live in slum. And when you come to the Philippines itself, you see also in Indonesia and others, you see inequality has been increasing. So we also see that rich and poor, there are clear borders. So how are we going to cope with this? Because when you see the goal of SDGs, we see that we don't want to leave anyone behind. But how can we do that? Because it's not that easy to do that. As mayors, as leaders, that's a big challenge. You cannot stop people to move into your city. So when we talk about SDGs, can we go? I cannot run by myself these slides. Okay. I don't know how many of you understand the global agenda, because SDGs is just one of the agenda. There are new urban agenda, there are Sendai framework for action that relates to disaster risk reduction. Also, there is a Paris Agreement on climate change. How can we translate this to our people, to our ordinary people about this global agenda? So when we see localization of global agenda, we don't want to just translate the global agenda into local context. What we want to see is that a process of empowering local leaders, local actors for implementing this global agenda. Actually, it has been a long process for local governments to get recognitions at the global arena. We started with the 1992 Earth Summit, and then Istanbul 1996. It was first time that local governments was recognized as important player in development. And then I don't know how many of you in Istanbul 1996. Maybe you're still young, of course. But what we see here, when we do the advocacy, we have to be united. So this is why in 2004 we merged 3 global organizations into one to speak the same language to make a local government stronger. So in 2004, United Cities and Local Governments was created. And then along the way, in 2013, the Global Task Force was created. Because when you see the number of city networks, the number of UN agencies working on local governments with local governments for local governments have been increased. So how can we have a consolidation effort to make sure that local governments get a voice, important voice in the global arena? So this is why we were happy that this is a number of global task force, more than 20 networks, and all of important players are there. So when I talk about sustainable development, I don't know how many of you know the indicators, 231 indicators and 169 targets. And when we look at the targets, 65% of targets relate to local actions. So how can we, local governments, that important players, can attain the SDGs if you don't get capacity, good capacity, you don't have a good institutional frameworks, you don't have a good or enough fundings to run? How can you do that? So this is why it's also important we have a roadmap on localizing SDGs. I don't know how many of you have prepared a roadmap in implementing SDGs in your city and your territory, and also a toolkit for SDGs. So I think we have to congratulate ourselves, because when you look at the new urban agenda, around 35 35 local governments have been mentioned in the new urban agenda. And when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you also see that local governments not only relate to goal number 11, but relate to almost all goals. And we also congratulate ourselves because we managed to make SDGs number 11 as a standalone goal. And it was a long process to do, with a lot of consultations, discussions, meetings, and even lobbying. So and we also called this Addis Ababa conference. We come up with a recommendation. Important is that with Addis Ababa, how can local governments get enough financing if we don't get enough authority to raise funds? We are not expecting central governments always to bring us money to local governments. But are we free as leaders, local governments, to raise our own funds? This is why legislation is a key for that, and also from the climate change perspective as well. So here, shaping the new urban agenda, we are also looking at the Goal 11 and in the 2030 agenda, and we also have a World Assembly of Local and Regional Governments, and in which we expect almost all of you to be in Quito for the next the adoption of the new urban agenda. So I don't want to explain these details because you know exactly why local governments should be in the front line in attaining the SDGs. So I want to go back to the importance of leaderships because the session is about leaderships, right? So the challenge is how can we create good leaders? How can we have good leaders like you more and more? Because when we talk about number of local governments, in Asia itself, we link more than 7,000 cities and local governments. In Indonesia, we have almost 600 local governments. In the Philippines, more than 1,200 or 300 local governments. How can we have at least all leaders are there, good leaders are there? How can we make sure that incumbent good leaders can stay? So, especially for women leaders, because when we see the number of women leaders, women mayors, the numbers have not been in good sign in several countries. So this is also a good challenge because we also have to build trust. So how can we build trust? I just give you an example of the case of governor in Jakarta. He's a double minority. He's Christian, he's not Muslim, he's also Chinese origin. But he managed to get trust from the people because he makes use of social media. So he created the transparency. All meetings that he has is on YouTube. You can see when he gets angry, when he scolds people, when he's not happy with his staff. You can see all. This is also kind of a new way of using social media to build trust and transparency. And also good governance with active participation of the people. And I have two last slides, just the last one. There are many things how you can integrate migration in a local planning and local management, but I just want to pick one example about public spaces. And in the public spaces, because the idea of public space is to create a social cohesion that not differentiate between rich and poor, everybody can use. And that when we talk about public spaces, and also reduce inequality, like the quality of public transport. Sometimes I miss when I go back to Jakarta is I can walk freely and then also enjoy the sidewalks, streets. But when you see the quality of most cities in Asia Pacific, we don't have a good quality of public spaces. Even the streets are used only by the rich because of the number of vehicles. So there are many, many things that we can do. But my last message is that we can do this if we are given a good enabling environment. We can have a good legislations, and with the support of central governments, we also have a good participation and provide a platform for all the stakeholders to participate in the planning and the management and make a big say that this is our city, this is our regions, and this is the place we belong. Thank you very much.
Distinguished mayors, distinguished heads of provincial and regional governments, distinguished participants, it's a real pleasure to be standing here in front of you as we have worked really hard for this third edition of the Mule Forum to take place. So as we are addressing the issue of leadership and in relation to the SDGs at local level, first of all, I think we have to acknowledge that it is indeed a real achievement that through the inclusion of migration in the SDGs, that migration is no longer viewed as a development failure, which is the way it has been framed for quite some time. And I think, this is really a major step forward for all actors at international, national, and local levels who have been actively working on the linkages between migration and development since decades, because this is not a new topic. So it is very clear that the SDGs cannot be implemented without the strong leadership of local and regional governments. And I think a lot of what has been said before me speaks very highly for that. And we also have to recall that, as it was also briefly mentioned, that local and regional authorities' voices in the leading up to the SDGs have been captured through rounds of consultations that were organized in 13 countries, together with a number of regional and global dialogues. And some really important key messages came out of these consultations, and I'd like to recall them. So first of all, it really was clearly stated that local and regional governments are critical for promoting inclusive, sustainable development. That also effective local governance can ensure the inclusion of local stakeholders by creating broad-based ownership, commitment, and accountability. And this is a very important point applied to migration. Also, that an integrated multi-level and multi-stakeholder approach is needed, and that strong national commitment to provide adequate legal frameworks, institutional and financial capacity to local governments is required. And this is really an absolute key point. So how do we apply these strong messages to the implementation of the migration-related elements of the SDGs at local level? First of all, I think it is really important to note that there is strong evidence that without the involvement of local actors, it is unlikely that we can succeed in this field. Indeed, important facts have been already mentioned by previous speakers, but we should also emphasize that really working only at the national level falls short in acknowledging the diversity of development and migratory contexts which exists within countries, and therefore only partially addresses the complexities and opportunities related to the impact of migration and development dynamics. So indeed, persisting inequalities, one of the identified drivers of migration, exists not only among different countries, but also within countries. So we therefore need an integral and bottom-up approach from the local level. The SDGs is also a truly universal agenda, which applies both to developing and developed countries. And that really provides for a unique framework to build more balanced partnership on migration between countries of origin and countries of destination, focused on this crucial development aspect. But we can really only deplore that in the current context, the response to this refugee crisis and the perceived migration crisis, that the potential of this balanced partnership that could give us the SDGs is not really explored or acted upon. But the story could be very different at the local level. Indeed, the SDGs provide for a unique platform to articulate the migratory dynamics which link sub-national territories across countries, whereby migrants tend to migrate between specific territories. So this could be the source of balanced partnership on migration among local and regional authorities, among cities, allowing us to build more effective policies capturing the full potential of migration for development. So as it was mentioned as well, it is clear that cities and local and regional authorities need technical and financial support to be able to implement the migration-related elements of the SDGs. And the Quito Local Declaration, which was an incredible outcome of the second edition of this Mayoral Forum, disentangles the SDGs through concrete action areas for cities and local and regional authorities. So how do we move along in concretely implementing this really important roadmap? I'd like to bring to your attention tools which have been developed in the context of the Joint Migration and Development Initiative. As you know, we are a global interagency program involving 7 agencies of the United Nations system. It's a program led by UNDP and also involving our close partners IOM and UNITAR, with whom we're also cooperating for the organization of this Global Mayoral Forum. So through this action of scaling up existing initiatives of local and regional authorities and cities in the field of migration across 3 continents, and a number of you in this room assembled here are partners in the field in this process, the GMDI has been documenting and testing local practices at work, and this has led to the creation of concrete knowledge products and tools for local decision makers which look into practical solutions and inventive approaches to link migration and local development. And these tools disentangle local policies and services which can be put in place in local context, whereby also facilitating the implementation of the SDGs. So these tools look into particularly how to integrate migration into local development dynamics and planning. And of course, participants to the training that we ran yesterday could explore some of these elements already. So the GMDI also cooperates with another very crucial process, which was already alluding to, which is led by UNDP and UN Habitat, also in cooperation with UCLG. That is the elaboration of the toolbox to help with the localization of the SDGs. And this toolbox is really under development right now, and it really has to be a participatory process whereby, we'll be trying to gather all of your practices. And in the context of the GMDI, we have been tasked to actually help with the integration of the migration element within that toolbox. And a lot of the practices that you're having will actually help us to feed that very important process. Also, besides the very important aspect of the SDGs, I just wanted also to take into consideration another very important conversation which is going on at the moment, that is Habitat 3, which is going to lead us to the adoption of the new urban agenda. And what is really comforting is that really through the mobilization, civil society organization of local and regional authorities networks such as UCLG, as well as involved UN agencies, we can see that human mobility and migration is being captured in what is right now just a draft. But it looks like we're going to have the instrument also within that important framework to bring together the critical issues of migration and cities. So I think, definitely we have ahead of ourselves a lot of work to do, and it's definitely a big challenge because indeed, how do we make all these global agendas land at local level? This is something that will need a lot of energy, a lot of support, definitely from the international community, but also a lot of convincing vis-a-vis national governments in order to have access particularly to the very important aspect, which are the fiscal resources. And we see that at the moment, this is a conversation that still remains to be concluded. So I will leave it there. But just to mention that, of course, as a global program, the GMDI, we are very much committed to assist along the line. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Haya and Dr. Koh. Final speaker for the session. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I was asked to talk about the value of knowledge networks and the role of universities in the context of attaining the SDGs through local leadership. There are two parts into my sharing. And the first one is I'd like to talk about the backdrop and the basic premise of my message. And the second part is about what we may see as the specific role of universities and academia in the context of building the social, the SDG and the local leadership capacities and the knowledge network and knowledge network building. For those of us who have not been to the first and the second Global Mayors Forums, I'd like to refresh that if one looks at the documents of the first Global Mayors Forum, which is called the 2014 Call of Barcelona, the forum highlighted the positive contributions of human mobility and migration to the creativity, the creation of diversity, the respect for diversity, tolerance, the creative and competitive spaces. And as such, the cities are considered as really the location, the locus of mobility, progress, and prosperity. In 2015, in the second Global Mayors Forum, in the Quito conference, there is very much a strong reiteration of the important role of cities in creating and strengthening development, even as the Quito conference also very strongly translate and try to define into action how the SDGs would work. And basically this says we should mind the responsibility that humanity has its urban environment and the protection of the human well-being to attend to. I think these two previous Global Mayors Forum are a good segue into our discussion in this third mayoral forum. But my other premise and background is, as a scholar of public administration and governance, I'd like to pick up on the point which was earlier emphasized, which is that while SDG is a universal and a global target and goals, the translation of the SDG is strongly, very much a local challenge, and it should be seen as contexted at the local level. My view as a scholar of governance is that the local government unit and the city, particularly, is the catchment basin of development and prosperity. And I agree in previous speakers that development and inclusiveness is basically translated and becomes tangible and is material when we touch base at the community or at the local level. And therefore, when we try to define migration and development as the focus of and as a thread that runs across the SDG, the locus or the location of the SDG is very strongly local. And it is at the local level where we see the diversity, the flavor, the color, and the texture of the development goals. Having said this, let me now respond to the main issue about the knowledge networks and the role of the universities. I operate on two things, the framework of what we call the town and gown partnership. The town refers to the city, and the gown represents the academia and the university. The town and gown partnership is inevitable. It is not only necessary, but it is inevitable if we were to do the translation and the operationalization of reasonable SDG focused on migration and development. Now, how do we see the translation and the interpretation of the town and gown partnership, and how do we build the knowledge networks, which involves the university or the academia? There are three elements, according to scholars, the three elements of the knowledge networks. One is institutional setup. Second is the capacity building of agents. And when we say agents, this refers to social agents, the diverse groups of people we find in society, the various stakeholders. And third, the physical improvement. Based on these three, we find that the academia and the universities have much to contribute by way of, one, in terms of the institutional setup, we need data analytics, and information taken both from the ground at the local level, but also looking at benchmarks from across, benchmarking at the global level, and putting this and translating the data into useful, relevant, informed policies, which of course is very much a function not only of the national government, but very much so putting color and texture to these informed policies at the local level. When we do the data and data analytics, I assume that this feeds into local policies, policies that would assist our local leaders. It would assist in terms of planning and also in terms of urban designing and the urban systems development. Particularly in the Philippines, and I am proud to say that the Quezon City government, for example, has already started to venture into the so-called informed policies by bringing in our planners, urban and regional planners, our scientists and technical experts from the university, from the academia, in building the capacities of cities and in connecting people to urban systems. In other words, the formation and formulation of the plan to bring in a reasonable and intelligible but relevant urban system planning requires the expertise of people from the academe, such as our urban planners, our scientists, our technical people. But not only that, having come to the number 2 element, which is the physical environment. The physical environment in urban areas, the cities, require safe, efficient infrastructure. And again, we have the important role of our scientists, planner, and technologists who come from the academe and the university. But even the physical infrastructure and the physical improvement will require the ability to understand and situate the role of social scientists and communities. And it is here with the social scientists and the community workers who deal with in a very humane ways of dealing with migration and in creating efforts in development. Finally, on the third element, in terms of the capacity building of agents to achieve a resilient community and a sustainable community, the capacity building of agents is not only an infrastructural effort, it is what we call the suprastructure effort, much more difficult to deal with. The suprastructure meaning enhancing capacities of everyone who are involved in the development of cities and towns. It means capacity building through trainings, through education, through information, so that everyone could be in sync with each other in terms of the urban development and the goals to achieve sustained SDGs. Therefore, what we call the hub and spokes. In the hub and spokes approach, if we understand the hub and spokes, the wheel of the bicycle, there is a hub which refers to the local leaders and who becomes the center of the wheel and it becomes the center of development. But they then have to connect to the spokes, to the value sectors, to bring in the involvement and the participation of social agents. It is in this regard that the academics have a particular importance and role in serving as a connector and as a contributor to contribute to systematic, rational planning by the local leaders, but also engaging and involving our citizens in achieving the role of participatory urban development and planning. The hub and spokes approach relies on the collaborative superstructure development, meaning more than the physical and the infrastructural development is a focus on the human capacity, the human building, and the human training. And this is where we say that the knowledge network is important. We need to bring in the knowledge contributor from the academe and the universities, because the knowledge network is not only about intellectual, academic, or mind functions. It is also, and it is very much increasingly, a material, a physical, and meta-material function. Without the confluence and the convergence of the knowledge participants and actors to which or of which the academic community is one, it is impossible or probably difficult to see an integrated, a sustainable, a well-planned urban system that will refer to and that will respond not only to a city or a town that is so much challenged by the global issues of migration, but it is also supposed to respond to the challenge of resiliency, climate change, and the natural disaster risks management challenges. So with this, I think the local leaders have to bring in or should be able to imagine how the academics and the technical experts could contribute into the so-called the knowledge network or the knowledge circuit. And by through this, we also hope that those who lie or who sit at the ivory tower can come down to the ground and contribute to build a more humane, a more inclusive, and a comprehensive urban system and urban development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ko. Well, we've certainly started a very interesting conversation from various perspectives here. But we will, for the sake of time, now I will pass the floor to Cécile, who will chair a tour de table so that we can hear from our guests